It was 5:30 a.m., and the first light of dawn had barely broken over the lush, volcanic hills of the Big Island. I was halfway through the trail, my boots sinking into the damp earth with each step, and my backpack felt like it was getting heavier by the minute. I'd been pushing myself for hours now, craving the solitude of nature and the personal challenge of the hike. But nature had other plans. My stomach rumbled in protest, that deep, gnawing feeling, the unmistakable sign that it was time to find a bathroom or something close to it. I stopped in my tracks, glancing around the trail. The thick canopy of trees above shielded the early morning light, casting the jungle floor in a mixture of dark shadows and soft green hues. There was no one else in sight, just the quiet sounds of the forest waking up, birds calling from somewhere high above, the distant hum of wind through the trees, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. And then, there was my stomach again, reminding me that I had no time to waste. I didn't want to give up on the hike, but I knew there was no ignoring it. The nearest restroom was probably a few miles away, so I started looking for a solution. In the distance, through the trees, I spotted something, bright yellow and standing out against the greenery. A porta potty. Relieved, I quickened my pace toward it. At least it wasn't some horrendous pit stop out in the woods, with no privacy. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd used one, but right now, I was beyond picky. I made my way through the dense brush, hoping that whoever placed it here hadn't forgotten to leave some toilet paper inside. Reaching the porta potty, I hesitated just for a second before I opened the door. A quick, shallow breath as I stepped inside, sealing myself off from the jungle outside. It was a typical porta potty. Stale air, cheap plastic walls, and a faint smell of disinfectant. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I immediately went to business. The sound of nature outside was muffled now, and for a moment it felt like I was in my own little world. That brief peace was shattered the instant I finished. I turned on my headlamp, squinting against the sudden brightness. The beam flickered across the walls, searching for toilet paper. That's when I saw it. In the corner, a dark, ominous shape hanging from a thick thread of web. My heart skipped. I froze. The beam of my headlamp locked on to the source of my panic. A massive banana spider, its body easily the size of my palm. I hadn't been expecting a spider of that size, especially not in a cramped, enclosed space like this. The spider's long, spindly legs twitched, and its yellowish-black body seemed to ripple slightly in the weak light of my headlamp. My breath hitched. I had seen plenty of spiders before, but none like this. A part of me wanted to just forget the whole situation and leave, but the other part, the part that wanted to finish what I'd started, was telling me to stay calm. I tried not to make any sudden movements, hoping I could grab the toilet paper and get out without disturbing the creature. I reached out for the one-ply roll to my left, my fingers trembling slightly. Just as my hand brushed the toilet paper, my headlamp flashed directly on the spider's body, illuminating its terrifyingly intricate features. Its legs twitched, and then suddenly it bolted. It was like something out of a nightmare. The spider zipped across the corner of the porta potty, its speed unnatural. It spun around in circles for a few seconds, almost like it was disoriented, before it made a beeline toward me. I barely had time to process what was happening when it darted under the rim of the toilet, between my legs, and there, I felt the cold tickle of its legs brush against the inside of my underwear. I'm not sure how to describe the panic that washed over me, but it was instant. My heart hammered in my chest. For a split second, I thought I had imagined it, that it was a hallucination from sleep deprivation or the absurdity of the situation. But no, it was real, and I could feel it. I was frozen in place, not sure whether to scream or run, or just curl into a ball and hope the spider would go away. I tried to stay calm, slowly wiggling my hips from side to side, hoping the movement would encourage the spider to crawl back out and away from me. But instead, it didn't. Instead, it crept higher, crawling up my leg, brushing against the skin of my inner thigh. This was no longer about just finding the toilet paper. This was survival. I yelped in horror as I felt its legs skittering upward. I looked down, panic and sheer terror mounting as I saw the creature inching up toward my waist. It wasn't moving slowly anymore. It was climbing with purpose, as if it had all the time in the world and no regard for the fact that it was now inside my underwear. At this point, all rational thought went out the window. I wasn't thinking about getting the toilet paper. I wasn't even thinking about how gross the situation was. The only thought in my head was, get it off, get it off, get it off. I scrambled, shifting my body back and forth, my hands frantically tugging at my pants, trying to dislodge the spider, but nothing worked. Every time I tried to adjust, it just seemed to make the situation worse. I could feel it on my skin, its legs moving faster, its body pressing against me as it scuttled upward like it had a mission. The idea of just sitting there and letting it crawl all over me was beyond comprehension. My breath was coming in sharp gasps, and I could feel the tension building in every muscle, like a spring about to snap. Finally, with no other choice, I let out a blood-curdling scream and bolted upright, pants around my ankles, and charged out of the porta-potty. I didn't care about my dignity at this point. I was running from a nightmare. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I tore off into the jungle, leaving the porta-potty behind me. I was still screaming, yelling at nothing in particular, too freaked out to even comprehend the full extent of the situation. I didn't stop running until I was several yards away, panting and trying to catch my breath. My legs were shaking, my heart racing so hard I thought it might burst. I slowly looked down at my clothes, my pants still tangled around my ankles, but thankfully, I wasn't wearing the spider anymore. My gaze flicked back toward the porta-potty. The thing was still there, its door slightly ajar, but the spider? Gone, like it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, gathering myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There were no words to describe it, no real way to process the horror. But in that instant, I felt small, like the whole world had shrunk down to the size of that tiny, terrible space I had just fled from. As I finally caught my breath and adjusted my pants, I couldn't help but laugh, nervous, shaky laughter that didn't feel real. There was nothing else to do. I had survived the ordeal, but my dignity, my composure, that was gone along with the spider. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that porta-potty, so I hiked on, the morning sun rising higher and the trail stretching on in front of me. But the memory of the spider stayed with me long after. The rest of the hike, I didn't look over my shoulder once, and I made a vow, no more early morning hikes. Not until I could be sure that spiders, asterisk especially asterisk giant, terror-inducing spiders, knew their place. Back then, I was a 22-year-old with more ambition than money. I just moved to California, desperate to escape the clutches of a dead-end job and even worse weather. I didn't have much, just a beat-up old car, a sleeping bag, and a few camping supplies I'd cobbled together from secondhand stores. It was the middle of October, and I was itching to see something truly wild, something that felt real and raw. I had heard about the redwoods and the ancient forests up north, and I knew I had to experience it for myself. So, I packed my bags, grabbed my gear, and drove up the winding highways, heading into the dense, untamed woods of Northern California. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, and the trees, those massive, towering redwoods, loomed like silent sentinels in the distance. The drive was long, but the closer I got, the more alive I felt. My heart beat faster, and my head was filled with the thrill of the unknown. I reached the forest by dusk, not entirely sure where I was, but knowing I was far enough out of town to feel like I was truly alone. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, and the only sounds I could hear were the rustling leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. The light was fading quickly, and I didn't want to drive further. So, I pulled off the road and found a secluded spot just off a barely visible trail. It looked like no one had been there in a while. Perfect. I laid out a large, weathered blanket on the forest floor and set up my camp, doing my best to be quick and quiet. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention, especially from anyone who might be out here with less than friendly intentions. But mostly, I just didn't want to disrupt the peace of the woods. The thought of those ancient trees surrounding me, their roots winding through the earth, gave me a strange sense of comfort. After a quick meal of trail mix and granola bars, I crawled into my sleeping bag, wrapping myself in a few extra blankets to ward off the chill. As I lay there, staring up at the dark canopy above, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. It was just me and the forest. There was something magical about being so far from anything, so far from the life I'd left behind in the city. It didn't take long before I drifted off to sleep. The night was quiet, and the air was cool but crisp. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it had a certain weight to it. The weight of the forest, of the centuries-old trees standing sentinel in the dark. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. A shift in the wind, a creak of the trees, or maybe just a feeling deep in my gut. But I woke suddenly. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The darkness of the forest pressed in around me, and I lay there still, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. The only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves above, swaying in the wind. But then, my eyes adjusted, and I realized something that made my heart skip a beat. The perimeter of the blanket, the very edge where it touched the forest floor, was lined with spiders. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, that maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. But no, they were real, long-legged black spiders, their bodies glossy in the dim light of the flashlight I'd turned on. There were dozens of them, lined up so perfectly that they formed an unbroken ring around me. They stood leg to leg, facing outward, each one motionless, watching the dark. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. They were bigger than any spiders I'd ever seen before, and there were so many of them. They didn't move. They didn't seem to do anything, but they were there, surrounding me, watching me with their cold, unblinking eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump up and run, but my body wouldn't move. I stayed perfectly still, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I couldn't even think straight. All I could focus on was the spiders. I tried to rationalize it. They were just waiting for some unsuspecting bug to wander along. Maybe they'd scurried there to find food, or maybe they just found a place to rest. I didn't know, but I convinced myself they weren't dangerous. Not to me, anyway. I curled the blankets tightly around myself, trying to create a barrier between me and the spiders. I turned off the flashlight, trying to calm myself down, telling myself to relax. But I couldn't relax. My heart was still racing, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see the spiders' long, spindly legs crawling up and down the edges of my blankets. I could feel the weight of their gaze, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for something. I lay there motionless for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe too loudly. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and each minute felt like an eternity. My body ached from being so tense, but I didn't dare move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. It was like my mind had given up on worrying, and my body just needed to rest. I wrapped myself tighter in the blankets, pulling them up over my head, and eventually, I fell back asleep. The forest was still around me. The spiders still lined the perimeter of my blanket, but my mind faded into sleep. When I woke up again, it was full daylight. The sunlight streamed down through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the forest floor. The air had warmed slightly, and the world felt quieter, calmer. And when I looked around, I saw nothing but the remnants of my campsite. There were no spiders, no black, long-legged creatures standing guard around me. The blanket lay undisturbed, the trees stood silent and tall, and there was no sign of the hundreds of spiders I had seen just hours earlier. I stood up slowly, feeling the ache in my limbs from the night spent curled up, trying to avoid movement. I couldn't make sense of what had happened. Had I dreamt it? Had I hallucinated the whole thing? The idea seemed impossible, but there was no evidence to suggest otherwise. The forest was still the same, and the spiders were gone. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get out of the forest, away from whatever it was that had happened the night before. The forest seemed like a different place now. It was still beautiful, still ancient, but there was something unsettling about it. something I couldn't shake. As I drove away, the redwoods stretching up on either side of the highway, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark shape lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, just the road, just the trees. I've been back to the redwoods since then, but I've never camped in that spot again. Sometimes, when I pass through the forests, I wonder if the spiders were real or if it was just a figment of my imagination. But then I remind myself, the forest is full of things we can't see, full of things we might not understand, and maybe some things are best left in the dark. It was late October in Northern California, and the air had a sharp bite to it. The sun was just starting to dip behind the ridge as I began my hike. I had come here for the quiet, the solitude. I liked to get away from the noise of everyday life. There were fewer people on the trails this time of year, and that was exactly what I was looking for. A few hours of peace and space to think. I was 28, in decent shape, and had hiked these hills before. I knew my way around the trails, even if it had been a while since I'd done anything this remote. My friend Kyle had come with me, but we had split up to do our own thing for a while. We'd parked at the trailhead earlier in the afternoon, near a small creek that ran through the foothills. It was a bit of a climb to get up into the valley, but nothing we couldn't handle. The forest around us was dense, pine and oak mostly, but there was a certain openness to the higher elevations. From the summit, the view was incredible. Jagged peaks in the distance and rolling hills beneath them, golden grass swaying in the wind. I'd been hiking for about an hour when I crested the ridge and saw the valley below. I was already feeling the effects of the climb. My legs were burning, my breath a little ragged, but I pressed on. The view down into the valley was almost like something out of a dream. Deep green forests, a creek snaking its way through the center, and wide open spaces where the trees had cleared. I took a deep breath and started down the trail toward it, not in any rush but moving with purpose. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows on the ground, and the temperature was starting to drop. I figured I had maybe an hour or two before it got too dark. I reached the bottom of the ridge and stood at the edge of the valley, scanning the area. I didn't see anything unusual at first, just the natural beauty of the place. But as I took a few more steps forward, I began to notice something strange. There were patches of cleared ground, areas where the underbrush had been removed in large, circular sections. It didn't look natural. My instincts kicked in, and I stopped in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the valley again, this time more carefully. That's when I saw them. Rows and rows of green plants, lined up in neat rows, stretching out across the valley as far as I could see. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at, but the more I focused, the clearer it became. They were marijuana plants, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, arranged in perfect lines, each one growing in the rich soil of the valley. The sight hit me with a mix of disbelief and unease. I had heard rumors of illegal grow operations in the area, but this was different. This was something on another level. This wasn't a small-time operation. This was something industrial. The scale of it was terrifying. I stepped back, careful not to make any noise. I could see hoses running through the plants, feeding them water from reservoirs hidden among the trees. Netting was stretched over sections, camouflaging the operation, making it hard to spot from the air. It was almost like the valley had been transformed into a hidden factory. My heart was racing now, the adrenaline flooding my system. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was spinning with thoughts of what I had stumbled upon. I took a few steps back, about to turn around and head back to where Kyle and I had split up, when I heard something, the faintest rustling sound. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I didn't know what it was at first, but then I heard it again. A footstep, then another. They were coming from the other side of the valley, from where the plants were thickest. I instinctively crouched down, blending into the underbrush as best as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying not to make any noise. My eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. someone or something was out there. It wasn't just one person. There were several moving cautiously through the plants. I could make out shapes now, their silhouettes barely visible through the dense vegetation. They weren't walking casually either. They were moving with purpose, like they were on a mission. My thoughts raced. Had they seen me? Did they know I was here? I waited, barely breathing, as they continued to move closer. My fingers tightened around the strap of my backpack, and my mind began to race through every possible scenario. None of them were good. I knew I had to get out of there, fast, but I couldn't move yet. If I made a sound or drew attention to myself, I'd be trapped. I'd heard enough stories about people stumbling onto these kinds of operations and disappearing without a trace. It wasn't something I wanted to test. The footsteps grew louder. Whoever they were getting closer. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I glanced around, looking for a way to escape. There was a thick stand of trees nearby that might give me some cover, but it was a good distance away. I could make a run for it, but I wasn't sure I could get there without being seen. I waited, trying to steady my breath, my hands clammy with sweat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I heard voices now, muffled but distinct. They were talking, but I couldn't make out the words. I strained my ears, hoping to catch something useful. Then I saw them. 2 men, both wearing camouflage gear, emerged from the trees and walked down the rows of plants. They weren't looking my way, but they were close, only 20 yards away, moving steadily through the valley. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder. The other carried a large, black duffel bag. They stopped for a moment, looking at something in the distance, and I took the opportunity to move. I backed up slowly, inching my way toward the trees. I knew I had to keep my movements quiet, but the urge to run was overwhelming. The distance between me and them seemed to stretch out forever, each step feeling like a lifetime. Finally, I reached the trees and ducked behind them, heart pounding. I pressed my back against the rough bark and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't afford to panic, not yet. I had to think this through. The men had passed by now, but I couldn't take any chances. I waited for several more minutes, watching the valley below. No one else appeared, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I'd known that was a possibility, but the reality of it hit me hard. There was no way to call for help. If something went wrong, I was on my own. I didn't wait any longer. I moved quickly, sticking to the trees for cover as I made my way back toward the ridge. My thoughts were a whirlwind. Did I go back for Kyle? Should I try to get to the car and get out of here? I knew I couldn't go back down the way I'd come. I had no idea if those guys were still in the valley, but I wasn't about to risk running into them again. Instead, I started climbing back up the ridge, staying as low to the ground as possible, moving silently but with urgency. When I finally reached the top, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I knew I had to get out of this place. I sprinted across the ridge, moving toward the trailhead, my legs aching, my lungs burning. The adrenaline was still pumping through me, but I kept going, pushing myself harder. I didn't stop until I reached the car. Kyle was already there, pacing nervously by the side of the road. He saw me approach and gave me a questioning look, but I didn't want to talk about it just yet. We both got in the car and I didn't look back. We drove off, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whole time, I felt like I was still back in that valley, like I was being watched. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never come back here. Not to this spot. Not to this valley. Whatever it was, whatever I had stumbled onto, I was done. The next morning, I reported what I'd seen to the authorities, though I never expected them to do anything about it. And they didn't. No one ever did. I don't know what happened to the people running the grow operation, but I didn't want to find out. I wasn't going to risk my life again by poking around. Sometimes, when I'm out hiking now, I'll catch myself thinking about that valley, about the rows of plants and the men who were guarding them. It was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life, and the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out of there makes my stomach turn. I haven't been back to Northern California since. The morning was crisp, with a slight chill still hanging in the air as I pulled my truck off the main road, onto the gravel path that led to the trailhead. I'd hiked this trail a dozen times before, always with my girlfriend, Hannah. It was one of those places we liked to escape to, a quiet spot that seemed far enough from the bustle of the world but still close enough to feel safe. The trail was mostly wooded, winding its way through dense trees, the kind that formed a canopy that blocked out the worst of the sun. It was the perfect place to get lost in nature, to breathe, to clear your head. That morning, though, something felt off. As I turned the truck off and stepped out into the cool air, I noticed the first unusual thing: the number of vehicles parked around the trailhead. State police SUVs, county sheriff's cars, and a large crime scene investigation van. It wasn't just the cars. The people, too, were a sight to behold. Officers in full hazmat suits with respirators stood around, talking quietly, clearly coordinating something. Investigators in blue jumpsuits moved between them, examining the ground and taking notes. My stomach churned. The vibe here was all wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I glanced at Hannah, who was already frowning at the scene. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't know," I replied, my eyes still scanning the area. "But I'm guessing it's not good. We were supposed to hike up the trail, but now, with all these authorities milling about, the idea of going forward felt wrong. Still, curiosity gnawed at me, so I started walking toward the trail. I could feel Hannah hesitate behind me, but I didn't stop. Not yet. As we approached the trail's entrance, one of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern face and dark sunglasses, noticed us. He gave us a quick once-over, then nodded, holding out a hand to stop us. "Sorry, folks. This area is off-limits right now." I paused, raising my hands slightly in a gesture of surrender. "We're just here to hike," I said, trying to sound casual, though the nerves creeping up in me were impossible to ignore. I'd never seen so many police in such a remote location. There was something about the way they were moving that made it clear this wasn't just a routine operation. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced over at his colleague, a younger woman with blonde hair, who was busy talking to someone on a radio. Then he turned back to me. "I understand, but you'll have to leave. It's a crime scene." Hannah's hand squeezed mine. "What happened?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling a bit now as she looked around at the suits and vans. The officer paused again, clearly not wanting to divulge much. "Can't say. Just get back in your truck and head on out." I nodded, but something in me wanted more. "I've hiked this trail before," I said, trying to push for some answers. "I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. You sure everything's okay?" The officer's gaze hardened, and for a moment, I thought he might just tell us to leave for good. Instead, his eyes shifted to the trail behind him, and that's when I saw it. Just past the entrance, within view, there were a few shapes that didn't belong. They were covered with white sheets, but they weren't perfectly flat. They had bumps, irregular shapes underneath that made my stomach turn. The blood was already mostly dried into the dirt, but the stains were dark and unmistakable. Part of me wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like a train wreck, and I was glued to it. Before I could process what I was seeing, Hannah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. She was whispering something under her breath, something that was too frantic for me to catch. The officer noticed her distress and gave me a pointed look. "You'd better go," he said, stepping closer, his voice lower now, more insistent. I swallowed hard, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. "I don't think those were there the other day," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer's eyes darted to the crime scene again, his lips tightening. Then, without another word, he turned and walked briskly toward a nearby group of officers who were discussing something in a huddle. I felt Hannah tug on my arm, urging me to follow her, but I couldn't stop staring. My mind raced. What had happened here? What had they found? We turned back toward the truck, but the strange tension in the air clung to me. I hadn't felt this uneasy in years, maybe ever. As we walked back to the vehicle, the scene behind us seemed to loom larger with each step, even though we weren't looking at it anymore. We climbed into the truck, and for a moment, Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us until I finally broke it, my voice shaky. "What the hell do you think happened back there?" I asked. Hannah shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think it's something we should mess with." I agreed, but my mind couldn't let go of the sight of the bodies covered in white sheets, the blood staining the earth. What had happened here? What was it that the police weren't telling us? As I drove us back toward the main road, the weight of the day settled over me, and I felt like I couldn't shake it. Something dark had happened in that quiet forest, something that shouldn't be ignored. The unknown loomed, and I hated that I couldn't let it go. The next few days were filled with a quiet sort of tension that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on work, on the small things that usually kept my mind distracted, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shapes in the dirt, the bloodstains, the way the white sheets were crumpled in a way that made no sense. The entire thing felt wrong, like it wasn't just a crime scene, it was a warning. Then, just as I thought I could forget about it, a knock came at the door. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of evening where the shadows grow longer and everything seems quieter. Hannah had just left to grab dinner, and I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard it. I opened the door, expecting to see a neighbor, but instead, it was two detectives, both in plain clothes. One was a tall man with dark hair, the other shorter and with glasses. They introduced themselves and asked if they could come inside. I stepped back, uncertain but polite. "Sure," I said, still not understanding what was going on. "What's this about?" "We need to ask you a few questions," the tall detective said, and there was something in his tone that immediately made me uneasy. "It's regarding your visit to the trail earlier this week." I nodded slowly, suddenly feeling like the air had thickened around me. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The detective gave me a tight smile, but his eyes never wavered. "You said something while you were there, something about the bodies not being there the other day." I frowned, recalling the moment. "Yeah, I did say that. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just pointing out that it seemed strange." "Did you notice anything else?" the shorter detective asked, stepping forward slightly. His eyes were sharp, and his voice was laced with tension. I hesitated, trying to gather my thoughts. "No, I mean, there was a lot of police activity, a lot of people in suits, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary except that the bodies were just there." It was unsettling. "Did you touch anything? Move anything? Get too close?" the tall detective pressed. I shook my head. "No, I swear. We just walked by. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't know it was a crime scene." The two detectives exchanged a glance, and I could tell they weren't satisfied with my answers. Still, they nodded, their faces tight. "All right," the shorter one said. "We may need to contact you again if we have more questions." "Sure," I replied, but I could tell they weren't done with me. As they left, I felt a growing sense of dread. There was more to this story, something darker than I had originally imagined, and now somehow I was part of it. Over the next few weeks, the trailhead remained closed. Word spread quickly about what had happened there, though no one could confirm the details. It seemed that whatever the police were investigating was too sensitive, too complicated to share with the public. And just like that, the case went cold. Months passed, and I tried to forget about it all, but the question lingered, gnawing at me. What had happened there? Who had been killed and why? Every time I passed that trail, I couldn't help but glance toward it, wondering if the police were still there, still searching for answers that might never come. I never heard anything else about it, no closure, no updates. It just disappeared into the fog of unsolved mysteries. And in some ways, that was even worse. I'd never know the full story. The fear of the unknown was far worse than anything I could have imagined. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when the world seemed too still, I wondered if I'd ever be free of that feeling. The feeling that the trail held something I wasn't meant to see, and that I'd never fully escape it. I was walking through the woods, heading to my grandfather's cabin in the winter of 2008. The air was bitterly cold, my breath coming out in white clouds that hung in the still air before vanishing into the darkness. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and the weight of my pack pressed down on my shoulders. I had taken this path dozens of times before, but winter made it different. Dangerous. The early darkness and the ice-hidden roots had already caused me trouble once before, and I wasn't about to take another fall, so I brought a lantern with me this time. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. I gripped my lantern tightly, the weak glow barely cutting through the heavy darkness pressing in from all sides. My grandfather's cabin was only about a mile ahead, just past a frozen creek and up a small hill. I focused on that thought, willing myself forward through the thick, suffocating quiet. Then I saw it, a figure on the other side of the trail, standing in the darkness just beyond the reach of my lantern's glow. My breath hitched in my throat. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, the way the trees twisted in the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was standing there, still, watching me. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. My fingers trembled as I adjusted my grip on the lantern. I hesitated before raising it slightly, angling the light towards them. The glow spread across the snow-covered ground, illuminating the figure just enough for me to make out their shape. They didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving, silent. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could feel their eyes on me. My stomach twisted in a knot. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a hunter? A lost hiker? Someone from one of the neighboring cabins? But something felt off. The way they just stood there, so still, so deliberate. The cold suddenly felt sharper against my skin. I didn't say anything. I didn't dare. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, frozen in place, staring at them as they stared back at me. The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like an eternity. My body screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I was locked in place by some deep, primal fear that I couldn't rationalize. And then, as if sensing my unease, I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I reached for the knob on my lantern and twisted it off. Darkness swallowed me whole. I barely had time to register what happened next. The moment the light went out, I heard it, movement. Fast, frantic movement. Footsteps tearing through the snow. Branches snapping. Whatever or whoever it was bolted deeper into the woods like a wild animal, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I turned and ran. Hard. Faster than I had ever run before. The cold air burned my lungs, my boots slipping on the snowpacked trail, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I could still hear them. Behind me, somewhere, moving fast. The cabin. I just had to make it to the cabin. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I pushed forward, forcing my way through the night. The frozen creek came into view, the ice gleaming faintly under the moonlight. I didn't even slow down. I leaped across, nearly slipping on the other side, but I caught myself and kept going. I didn't dare look back. The cabin was just ahead. I could see the faint glow from the windows, my grandfather's lantern left burning outside like always. Safety. I practically threw myself at the door, fumbling with the handle, my fingers numb and shaking. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Silence. I pressed my back against the door, listening. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, but outside, there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, nothing but the wind howling through the trees. I stayed there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just some hunter, a lost traveler, someone who was as startled by me as I was by them. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. I kept the lantern by my side, ready to turn it on at the slightest sound. But nothing came. By morning, I forced myself to go outside, to look for any signs of what had happened. I half expected to find tracks in the snow leading back into the woods, some proof that I wasn't just imagining things. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had been there at all. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw that night. I told my grandfather about it, but he just shook his head and said people see strange things in the woods sometimes. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. But even now, 15 years later, I still remember the way that figure stood there, watching, unmoving, silent, and I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned off that lantern. It was late September in the Adirondacks. The trees were starting to turn, with vibrant bursts of red and gold breaking through the evergreens. My wife, Emily, and I had been planning this canoe camping trip for months. We had both been craving some solitude in nature, away from the city's relentless hum. The plan was simple: find a secluded spot on one of the many winding lakes up north, set up camp, and just disconnect for a while. We had arrived in the early afternoon, a day ahead of schedule, and paddled out to a small, narrow lake hidden deep in the woods. The kind of place where the water was so clear you could see the rocks beneath, where the trees reached down to the water's edge, their branches almost touching the surface. We set up camp on a small beach near the lake's edge, the sounds of birds chirping, the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant splash of fish breaking the water. It was perfect. By nightfall, we had a small fire going, roasting marshmallows and chatting about nothing in particular. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that makes you bundle up in a jacket but still leaves the fire warm on your face. The stars had just started to appear, and the full moon was rising over the mountains, casting an eerie light over the lake. We hadn't seen another soul all day, and it felt good. This was why we'd come here. Later that evening, after the fire had burned down to embers, I decided to head down to the lake to wash my face. It felt refreshing to dip my hands in the cool water, the chill from the lake numbing my fingers. The night was still, and the moonlight shimmered on the surface of the water like liquid silver. That's when I noticed something odd. Across the lake, barely visible in the darkness, two small lights flickered. At first, I thought they were reflections of stars or perhaps just a trick of the moonlight. But no, they were moving. The lights were headlamps, moving slowly and deliberately across the opposite shore. My heart skipped a beat. We were in the middle of nowhere. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here, at least not this late. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the darkness kept most of the scene hidden. The lights grew dimmer, as though whoever was out there was running out of power. They blinked out entirely after a moment, leaving the shore once again shrouded in darkness. Then I heard it, a loud, deep snort, followed by more rustling. It wasn't a small noise either. It echoed across the still lake. The sound was too big, too deep. My first thought was that it was a moose, though I had never heard one make such a noise before. Could it have been a bear? It was hard to tell, but it definitely wasn't something I wanted to get closer to. My heart started to race. This wasn't the sort of sound you want to hear when you're all alone, in the woods, in the dark. I thought about Emily back at camp, and the thought of leaving her alone here while I investigated made me uneasy. But at the same time, I didn't want to just ignore it. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to call out. My voice felt small in the vast emptiness of the lake. "Hey, are you all right?" There was a pause, and I thought I had imagined the sound of someone replying. But then, a voice called back, weak and muffled. "Yeah, we're fine. Just got lost." I could hear the tension in the voice, and something about it made me uneasy. I hadn't expected anyone else to be out here. Who else would be on this remote lake at this hour, especially on the wrong side of it? The lights flickered back on again, and I saw them, two figures, their movements slow and uncertain. "How did you get lost?" I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. The man explained in an exhausted tone. They had started their hike from the wrong parking lot, taking an extra hour or two to even find the lake. And then, when they arrived, they somehow ended up on the wrong side of the lake, far from any campsites. They were trying to reach the next site, but they had no map, and worse, their headlamps were nearly out of battery. The big noise I had heard was probably the animal they had startled, and it seemed like it had spooked them pretty badly. "Do you need help?" I asked, already standing up. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but it felt like the right thing to offer. Yes, the voice came back, relieved. We could really use some help. The decision was quick. I grabbed my life jacket, and Emily helped me load the canoe with a spare flashlight and a few extra supplies. The lake was eerily quiet as I paddled across to the other side. My mind kept racing, trying to figure out what had really happened. The way they sounded, so shaken up, it didn't add up. They weren't just lost. Something had scared them. I reached the shore and saw them standing by a large rock. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, their clothes disheveled, the fear still evident on their faces. They looked like they had been walking for hours, maybe more. They didn't seem like the type to get easily lost. "Here," I said, handing them the flashlight. "It's not much, but it should help you get to the next site. I'll wait here while you set up, just in case." The woman took the flashlight with shaky hands, her face pale. The man thanked me, but there was something about the way he held himself that made me feel uneasy. He kept glancing around, his eyes darting into the trees as if expecting something to jump out at him. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked again, trying to sound reassuring. Yeah, he said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. I stayed for a while longer, watching them set up their tent. The woman was still visibly nervous, checking the woods every few seconds, while the man fumbled with the tent poles. I stayed just outside their camp, making sure nothing strange happened while they got settled. The rustling noise from earlier had stopped, but the woods still felt off. The air was thick with silence, except for the occasional drip of water from the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way they had reacted, how they had sounded, like they were genuinely scared of something. But what? I didn't have time to dwell on it too long, though. They were fine now. They were safe. And that was all that mattered. Finally, after making sure they were all right, I turned and paddled back across the lake to our camp. Emily was sitting by the fire, the warmth of it chasing away the chill that had settled in. I couldn't help but tell her about the two hikers, but even as I recounted the story, something gnawed at me. The sounds, the fear in their voices, and the strange animal noises that had started it all. It didn't sit right. As I lay there in the tent that night, the wind picking up outside, I couldn't help but wonder what really happened to those hikers. Were they just lost, or was something more out there in the woods? I wasn't sure, but as the hours stretched on, I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, the sounds of the forest filling my dreams, the crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves, and that deep, echoing snort. The next morning, we packed up and made our way out of the lake. The hikers were gone by the time we woke up, their campsite packed up, the area quiet once again. No sign of them anywhere. Maybe they had made it to the next site. Maybe not. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that something wasn't right that night. And whatever it was, I'm glad I was there to help them, to get them out of the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that they'd been running from something bigger than just getting lost. And maybe, just maybe, I was too close to finding out what that something really was. I could feel the cold creeping in before the sun had even fully set. The air was still, except for the occasional gust of wind that rustled the trees above me. The first night of a solo trip always put me on edge, and this time was no different. It was early September 1998, and I had set out on a solo backpacking trip in a remote part of Ontario. I had hiked nearly 10 miles through dense forest, following an old, barely used trail that wound its way through a thick tangle of pines and birches before dropping down toward a rocky shoreline. The land sloped sharply down to a narrow pebble beach that met the dark, rippling water of a vast lake. My campsite was right on the edge of the tree line, where the forest gave way to open sky and water. I set up my tent in a small clearing just above the beach. It was a simple one-person tent. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep me dry and give me a thin layer of protection between myself and the outside world. I built a small fire, boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, and ate as the last light faded. The sky turned a deep blue, then black, and soon the only illumination came from my flickering fire and the pale glow of the moon reflecting off the water. The night sounds started quickly. The woods were alive with the chirps and rustles of unseen animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew these sounds were normal. I had spent enough time camping to recognize the usual symphony of the wild, but that didn't stop my mind from twisting them into something else. Every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig, became the footsteps of someone, or something, watching me from the shadows. I forced myself to stay calm. It was just me out here, I told myself. No one else. I was at least a day's hike from the nearest road, and this area wasn't well traveled. It was highly unlikely anyone else was nearby, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and settled into my sleeping bag. The fabric of the tent felt impossibly thin as I listened to the sounds outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering shadows on the nylon walls. I turned off my flashlight, leaving myself in complete darkness. The noises of the forest only seemed louder in the absence of light. The rustling leaves, the chirping insects. It was all amplified, pressing in on me. I tried to focus on my breathing, to slow my racing heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a heavy crunch, something larger than a raccoon or a fox, a deliberate step, breaking twigs beneath its weight. My entire body went rigid. I strained to listen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Another step, closer. A wave of cold fear washed over me. My mind jumped immediately to the worst possibilities. A bear, a cougar, hell, even another person. I felt a sudden, irrational certainty that I was about to die out here, alone in the dark, miles from help. My breath came in shallow, quiet gasps as I fought the rising panic. Then, a sudden crash. The sound of something tumbling, heavy and clumsy, dislodging rocks as it fell. It came from just outside my tent, near the slope leading down to the beach. My fingers fumbled for my flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before unzipping the tent door, my breath held tight in my chest. I clicked on the light and shined it outside. At first, I saw nothing but the uneven ground and scattered stones where the forest met the shore. My light flickered across the slope, following the disturbance. Then, at the bottom of the incline, I saw it. A large elk, sprawled awkwardly on the pebbled beach. It was alive, shifting and struggling to get back on its feet. My body, still rigid with fear, began to relax slightly as I took in the sight. The poor thing must have lost its footing in the dark and slipped down the slope. It looked unhurt, just dazed. My fear was quickly replaced by relief, then embarrassment. I had been ready to fight for my life over a clumsy elk. I watched for a few minutes as it regained its footing, snorted, and finally wandered off down the shoreline, disappearing into the darkness. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling the tension leave my muscles. I crawled back into my tent, zipping it up again. My heartbeat was still slowing, the adrenaline wearing off. The woods were still loud, but now the sounds felt normal again. Expected. I closed my eyes and, despite everything, sleep finally came. Josh and I had been searching for the perfect camping spot for over a year. We tried mountains, forests, valleys, anywhere that felt untouched. We wanted somewhere remote, somewhere we could sit by a fire without hearing distant voices or seeing the faint glow of a cabin. After a long search, we found a place that seemed just right. It was deep in the woods, at least a half-hour hike from the nearest dirt road and completely off any official trails. The land sat atop a high cliff that overlooked a slow-moving river below. The view was incredible, and the ground was flat enough for a tent. It felt like the kind of place only a handful of people had ever set foot in. That's exactly what we wanted. We hiked in with our gear, taking in the silence of the woods around us. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the river below. It was late afternoon by the time we finished setting up camp. One tent, a small fire pit, and our backpacks leaned against a fallen log. Josh suggested we explore a bit before it got too dark. We grabbed a flashlight just in case and followed the tree line, weaving between towering pines and low-hanging branches. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense enough to block out most of the fading sunlight. We made sure to keep the river to our right so we wouldn't get lost. That's when we saw it, a shack hidden in the trees. It wasn't a normal cabin or an old hunting post. It was strange, almost like a teepee, but built from scraps of aluminum, sheet metal, and a tattered blue tarp. The structure looked weathered but not abandoned. We stopped, looked at each other. Something about it was unsettling, but it was so close to our campsite that we needed to check it out. If someone was living there, we wanted to know. Slowly, we approached. The first thing I noticed was the bottles. Dozens of them. Wine bottles, whiskey bottles, scattered haphazardly around the entrance. Some were broken, glass shards glinting in the last light of day. Inside, through the torn flap of tarp, I could see an air mattress, fully inflated, resting on a makeshift wooden platform. And then there were the other things. Porn magazines, pages curled and damp from the elements. A pile of mismatched clothing, some of it disturbingly small. A rusty hacksaw, a bundle of rope, a single dirty boot lying near the entrance. No way someone just left all this here. Then I noticed the fire. Not a fire exactly, but the ashes of one. Still smoldering, wisps of smoke curling into the air. Josh and I locked eyes. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. Whoever had been here wasn't just some lost hiker. They were living here, and they were close. Without a word, we turned and started back toward our campsite. We walked fast but didn't run. Running felt like a bad idea, like it would make too much noise. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could hear Josh's breath coming in sharp bursts. As soon as our tent came into view, we knew we weren't staying the night. We tore the stakes from the ground, collapsed the tent, and stuffed everything we could into our packs. I barely remembered slinging mine over my shoulder before we took off into the woods, heading straight for the road. We didn't bother with the trail we had made coming in. We just moved, branches whipping against our arms and faces, feet slipping on loose dirt. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the only thing guiding us was the distant hum of the river. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind us. I never did, but I could feel it. That sensation of being watched, of something just out of sight. Took us almost an hour to reach the road. When we did, we kept going, not stopping until we saw the faint glow of Josh's truck parked at the end of the dirt path. We threw our gear into the back and climbed inside, locking the doors even though there was no one in sight. We sat there for a long time, breathing hard, hands shaking. Neither of us said anything. What was there to say? Josh started the engine and we drove. We never went back. We never told anyone exactly where that spot was. And we never camped that far from civilization again. It was a crisp autumn morning when my friend Lucas and I decided to hike through the vast, empty stretch of the Australian outback. We were both university students, eager to escape the clutches of city life for a few days, craving adventure in the remote wilderness. Our destination was a small, forgotten section of the outback, located far from any major tourist spots or towns, where the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly without interruption. It was the kind of place most people would never think of visiting. We had been preparing for this trip for months, spending hours researching the route, packing gear, and mapping out where we planned to stop for water and food. The remoteness of the area gave it a sense of eerie calm, but we felt ready, or so we thought. The only sounds out here were the occasional gusts of wind sweeping across the barren terrain, the soft crunch of our boots against dry earth, and the distant calls of birds. It was beautiful in its desolation. It had been 3 days since we entered the outback. We were far beyond the reach of cell phones, and the last sign of human civilization had been several hundred kilometers behind us. Our supplies were low, but we still had enough to get by for another couple of days. As we trekked along a narrow trail that snaked around the base of a rugged cliff, The sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth. Then something unusual caught my eye. A small, tightly wrapped plastic bag lay half hidden among the scrubby bushes at the base of the cliff. It wasn't the type of trash you'd typically find in a place like this. There was no sign of the usual discarded food wrappers or broken gear. This plastic bag looked fresh, undisturbed, and oddly out of place. We had been hiking for days, and the more we thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. No one else had come this far, at least not recently. Curious, we approached the bag cautiously. I bent down to examine it while Lucas stood a few paces behind me. The bag was scuffed, slightly torn at the edges, but still intact. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe some old food scraps or a broken piece of camping equipment. But when I pulled it open, my stomach sank. Inside were 5 or 6 wallets, all piled together. The wallets weren't high-end or anything, just cheap, plain leather ones. But the sight of them so carelessly discarded made my skin crawl. Some were open, others were closed, but they all seemed damaged, as though they had been tossed around and worn down by the elements. I gingerly picked one up, noticing the name on the ID card inside, Emma Matthews. The photo showed a young woman in her early 20s, with blonde hair and a bright smile. The birth date indicated she was only a few years older than us. As I flipped through the wallet, I saw a few credit cards, an old bus pass, and some crumpled notes. Everything about it felt too personal. I put that wallet aside and moved on to the next one. This one belonged to someone named Natalie Banks, another young woman, a little older by the look of the ID. The more I examined each wallet, the more unsettling it became. Every single one belonged to a woman, and the birth dates were all close to our age, late teens, early 20s. It felt strange, knowing that someone so young might be out here, so far from civilization. The strangest part, though, was the locations. Several of the cards indicated addresses in places like Darwin and Alice Springs, but there were also a few from Sydney and Brisbane, cities hundreds of kilometers away. It seemed improbable that these wallets, from such different places, could all end up in the same spot. We were in an area so remote that the only way to reach it was by rugged 4x4 vehicle or, more likely, on foot. What the hell? Lucas muttered from behind me, sounding just as confused and unsettled as I felt. He bent down to get a closer look. Who would leave these out here? We both stood there for a moment, the eerie quiet of the outback pressing in on us. It didn't feel right, not one bit. After a long pause, I closed the wallets and packed them into my backpack. Our original plan had been to continue hiking, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The sight of those wallets felt like a sign, like we had stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to see. I think we should tell someone, Lucas said after a long silence, his voice quieter than usual. He was right. We needed to report it, get someone else involved. But with no cell service and no one for miles, we'd have to wait until we reached the nearest town, which was still several days away. At least we had to finish the hike before we could get help. The next few days felt strangely tense. We spoke less than usual, the presence of the wallets weighing on us like an unspoken threat. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge the gnawing sense of unease, but it was there, creeping into every quiet moment. The outback seemed to press in around us, the isolation almost suffocating. The thought of the wallets stayed in my mind, and every time we passed another stretch of open desert, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. When we finally made it back to the nearest town, a small, nearly forgotten outpost in the middle of nowhere, we found the local police station and handed in the wallets. We explained everything. How we found them, how far we had hiked, and how out of place they seemed in such an isolated location. The officer who took them didn't say much, but his expression shifted the moment he saw what we were holding. At first, his eyes were blank, just like any other cop you might see. But when he glanced at the wallets, there was a subtle change, a tightness in his jaw, a quick flash of something unreadable in his gaze. He didn't ask any questions about how we had found them or why we were out there. He just nodded and told us they'd investigate it. The look he gave us, though, it stayed with me long after we left the station. We never heard from the police again. No one ever told us what they found or what had happened to the women whose names were on those cards. It wasn't until later that we discovered something strange about those names. It turns out, all of the women whose wallets we had found were reported missing in the past year, all in different parts of Australia. Some of them had been gone for months, with no sign of their whereabouts. The police, when pressed, never offered a clear explanation, just that the case was under investigation. Years passed, and Lucas and I often talked about that trip, especially when we'd see each other over a drink or at some university event. The feeling we had back in the outback, that overwhelming sense that we were trespassing in a place we weren't supposed to be, never really left us. We wondered if there was more to the story, if the wallets had belonged to hikers or maybe something darker. But no matter how much we tried to piece it together, it never made sense. In the end, we learned something important. Sometimes, it's better to leave certain things alone, especially when you're out there in the wild, in places where human presence is just a faint memory in the vastness of the landscape. And sometimes, there are things you can never truly understand, things that will never be explained, no matter how hard you try. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing but peace. The sun was barely over the horizon, casting its weak, early light through the canopy of trees. The air was cool, with a hint of dampness in the leaves and earth below, as if the woods had just woken up. I always liked hiking at this time. There's something about being alone on a trail early in the day. It's quiet, calm. Almost no one else is out there, and the only sounds are the calls of distant birds and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. Just me, my thoughts, and the world breathing in the forest. I had been on this trail dozens of times before. A familiar one, a good few miles through the woods outside of town. A quiet path that led through dense trees, winding up the side of a low mountain. You could get lost if you didn't pay attention, but I wasn't worried. The trails were well marked, and I knew my way around. But today felt different, even before I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, barely audible, like a whisper in the air, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It didn't belong. I didn't know what it was, but it caught my attention immediately. I stopped walking and stood still for a moment, trying to figure it out. The sound wasn't animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was musical, a faint, hollow tone, rising and falling. The kind of thing you might hear from a lone instrument played from afar. It didn't make sense. Who the hell would be out here, playing music in the middle of nowhere? I kept walking, curious but skeptical. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, some sound bouncing off rocks or trees. But as I moved forward, the sound became clearer. And then it hit me. A saxophone. Someone was playing a damn saxophone. I felt a strange shiver run up my spine. It wasn't like any music you'd expect to hear on a hiking trail. No radio blaring, no kids shouting, no group of hikers joking around. Just a single instrument coming from the heart of the woods. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. It was an odd contrast to the stillness of the forest, the sharp, smooth notes of the saxophone clashing with the quiet. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, haunting, like it was meant to be heard only by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. My steps slowed, unsure of what to expect. Who the hell would be out here with a sax? As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw him. He was walking at a steady pace, just ahead of me, his body swaying gently with the rhythm. The man was tall, dressed in a loose flannel shirt and worn jeans. His hair was long, wild, and messy, a tangled mess of dark curls that framed his face. He didn't seem to notice me approaching, too caught up in his own world, absorbed in his music. His saxophone gleamed in the dim morning light, held in front of him with a kind of relaxed confidence. The way he walked and played, it was as if he was completely in sync with the woods. I couldn't stop staring. His fingers danced over the keys effortlessly, and the sound he created was smooth, almost hypnotic, drifting through the trees like a strange melody that had no origin. I felt like I was walking in a dream, or more accurately, like I had wandered into some bizarre scene from a TV show. Everything was wrong. It didn't belong. It wasn't supposed to be happening. I kept walking, keeping my distance, but his presence was like a magnet. I had to know who this person was. Who goes hiking with a saxophone, just playing music in the middle of nowhere? I passed him, walking on the narrow trail that cut through the trees. For a split second, our eyes met, but there was no recognition. His expression was calm, almost serene, like he had been playing in this exact spot for hours, for years even. I wasn't sure if I should say something, but I didn't. I felt like it wasn't the kind of moment you should interrupt. And then he spoke. "Beautiful day for music, isn't it?" The words hung in the air, strangely out of place. I didn't respond, couldn't. I just kept walking, the unease growing in my chest like something was trying to crawl out. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow walked into a scene from Twin Peaks, that surreal, haunting atmosphere where everything is slightly off-kilter, and you're not sure who to trust or what's real. The woods felt like that now, familiar but warped. I felt like an outsider in some private moment, a moment that didn't belong to me. I glanced back. The man hadn't moved, still standing in the same spot, sax in hand, staring into the trees. His face was blank, emotionless. His music still floated through the air, thin and sweet, but there was something strange about it, something unsettling. I didn't look back again. As I continued on the trail, the feeling in my stomach only deepened. It was like I had crossed some invisible line, stepped into a world where the rules didn't apply, where people just wandered in and out, lost in their own worlds. I couldn't explain it, but the encounter felt wrong. And as the trail narrowed and the trees thickened, the quiet grew again, the saxophone now a distant sound, fading behind me. But the sound didn't disappear completely, kept following me, like it was attached to the woods, like it was tied to the very air. I could still hear it, faintly. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the path ahead. But then I heard something else. A crack of a twig, a soft rustling in the underbrush, far off to my left. I tensed. Someone else was out here, but I didn't see anyone. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods, the familiar path now feeling strange, as if the trees had closed in on me. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking in a dream, like the woods themselves were watching me. I tried to keep my pace steady, but my steps felt uncertain. Then, a voice. It wasn't the man with the saxophone this time. It was a low whisper, almost like a murmur, coming from the shadows. "Turn back," it said. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I looked around, but saw nothing. No one. Just the forest, still, quiet, and waiting. The saxophone's notes drifted through the trees again, faint but clear. It wasn't a warning I could ignore, but I didn't turn back. Instead, I kept walking. I had to. The only way out was forward, and I couldn't stop now. The whispers stopped, and then, just as abruptly as it had started, the music stopped too. The woods were silent. It was unsettling. The forest felt emptier now, as if the air itself had grown heavier, more oppressive. The path ahead was harder to see, and the trees seemed to lean closer, blocking out more light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Then I saw the clearing. The sunlight broke through the trees just ahead, casting long shadows across the dirt trail. I felt a sudden relief, like stepping out of a dream. The clearing was open, bathed in sunlight, and I could finally see the sky above, a wide stretch of blue that felt reassuring. But as I stepped into the clearing, I noticed something. Something was wrong. The ground was too clean, too perfect. There was no undergrowth, no grass, just bare earth. And in the center of the clearing was a strange, hollowed-out log, its sides blackened, like it had been burned. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked around, scanning the trees, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I realized the saxophone was playing again. This time it was louder, more forceful. The music seemed to rise from the ground itself, filling the air with a deep, resonant tone. But there was no one playing it. The man with the saxophone was gone. The woods were empty, yet the music filled every inch of the clearing, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I didn't understand it, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I turned around and ran. I didn't care where the trail went anymore, just that it was a way out. The music seemed to chase me, following me through the trees, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, the music stopped. The air was still. The sun was higher in the sky now, and I felt the weight in my chest slowly lift. I didn't look back. It took me a long time to make my way back to the car. Longer than usual. My legs were tired, my mind scattered. The entire hike felt like it had happened to someone else. I wasn't sure if it had been real, or if I'd imagined it all. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going back to that trail. It was the summer of 2009, and I was 14 years old. The kind of summer where the heat never really seemed to fade, and the days stretched on forever with nothing but time to kill. My family lived in a quiet, almost forgotten corner of rural Maine, nestled between miles of dense forest and craggy hills. The nearest town was small, only a few hundred people with more animals than there were folks. It wasn't uncommon for families to have properties that extended over several acres, with thick woods that seemed to stretch on for miles. I wasn't like most of the kids my age. While others spent their afternoons in front of video games or hanging out at the local ice cream shop, I would disappear into the woods. The trails around our house were well worn by old logging roads, abandoned pathways from decades ago. I didn't even need a map, because I had memorized every twist and turn of those trails. But sometimes, the thrill of venturing further kept me going, past the familiar, into the uncharted woods. I guess I was looking for something, adventure maybe, something to break the monotony. On this particular day, I had decided to push myself further than I'd ever gone. It was around noon when I started out, the sun already beating down heavily through the trees. I had no idea how far I'd gone, but I wasn't worried. The forest had always felt like home, its quiet whispers more comforting than unsettling. I kept walking, stepping over roots and through patches of tall grass, the distant sound of a stream bubbling somewhere to my left. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavy, but I didn't care. My sneakers crunched softly on the gravel of an old logging trail, leading me deeper into the woods. I couldn't have told you what made me stop. Maybe it was the silence, the sudden absence of birds chirping, or the way the wind had stopped moving in the trees. But when I did, I realized something was off. The air felt wrong, thick in a way that wasn't natural. Then the smell hit me. At first, it was faint, just a sharpness that tickled the back of my throat. But as I walked forward, it grew stronger, an overwhelming stench that turned my stomach. It wasn't the kind of smell you'd expect in the woods, not the earthy scent of damp leaves or fresh pine. No, this was something darker, something wrong. The smell led me off the path, toward a rocky outcrop that jutted out over a steep drop. I could see the cliff's edge up ahead, but the stench was almost unbearable now. My feet carried me forward, though I didn't want to go any closer. It wasn't curiosity that pushed me. It was instinct, that feeling that something had to be checked, even if I already knew I didn't want to see it. I stepped out onto the rocks, squinting into the sunlight as it bounced off the uneven surface. My eyes immediately fell on the mass below. At first, I thought it was a pile of fallen trees or brush, but as I looked closer, the horror of it hit me. It wasn't wood or plant matter, it was carcasses. Dozens of them, piled together like trash, their bodies twisted and contorted in grotesque positions. I counted at least 20 or 30. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I had never seen anything like this before. There were deer, and not just any deer. Most of them were decapitated. Their heads had been hacked off, tossed aside carelessly like broken toys. Some of them were fawns, their small bodies twisted and torn. Their empty eyes stared up at the sky, their fur matted with dried blood and rot. A few had been gutted, their insides spilled out onto the ground like someone had just discarded them without a second thought. The worst part, though, was the smell. It wasn't just the typical decay you'd expect from an animal carcass left out too long. This was something else. Something rancid, almost chemical, like the scent of death itself had soaked into the earth. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. Who would do something like this? And why? Just as I was about to turn and run, I heard something. The sound of engines, distant at first but growing louder. My body went rigid. There was no way I could get back to the trail in time. My only choice was to hide. I darted behind the nearest cover, a thick hemlock tree whose low branches barely shielded me from view. My heart pounded in my ears as I crouched low, trying to steady my breath. The two men came into view a moment later, driving two four-wheelers up the rocky path. Their engines roared, cutting through the silence of the forest, and they parked near the edge of the cliff, just a few feet away from where I hid. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't notice me. They were talking loudly, laughing, their voices harsh against the quiet of the woods. They seemed like any other hunters, wearing camouflage jackets and boots. But there was something off about them, something that didn't sit right in my gut. They didn't look like the men I'd seen around town, the ones who went hunting for sport or food. No, these men had a look in their eyes that made my skin crawl. Something cold, like they didn't care about the life of the animals they were killing. They seemed more interested in the act itself, in the brutality of it. One of them tossed two more carcasses onto the pile of dead deer. They were still warm, fresh kills. I could see the blood dripping from the bodies as they hit the pile, staining the ground. One of the men took a drag from his cigarette, flicking the ash into the pile before laughing again. The other man pulled out a can of beer, cracking it open with a hiss. They didn't speak much after that. Instead, they smoked and drank, the faint glow of their cigarettes lighting up the darkness of the trees. I could hear them laughing about something, their voices carrying in the still air. For what felt like an eternity, I stayed frozen, not daring to make a sound. My legs ached, my whole body trembling from the effort of staying still. Eventually, they mounted their four-wheelers again and roared off down the path, the sound fading into the distance. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. My lungs felt like they hadn't taken in a full breath in ages. My head spun with everything I had just seen. I waited for what felt like an eternity, ensuring they were really gone. Then, without looking back, I turned and ran, pushing through the woods like my life depended on it. I didn't stop until I was home, panting and covered in sweat, my mind racing with images of what I had found. I rushed inside and slammed the door behind me, my heart still racing. My parents were in the kitchen, but when I tried to tell them what I had seen, they didn't believe me. They said it was probably just an animal dump or that I had misunderstood what I'd seen. They scolded me for running off without telling them where I was going, and grounded me for the rest of the summer. But none of that mattered. What haunted me wasn't the punishment. It was the thought of what I had witnessed, what those men had done. Later that day, I told our neighbor, Mr. Jennings. He was a hunter, the kind of man who knew every inch of the woods like the back of his hand. When I mentioned the pile of carcasses, his face went pale. He immediately said I needed to tell the game warden, so he drove me down to the town hall and reported it. The investigation that followed didn't lead anywhere. The game warden and a few officers went up to the site, but by the time they got there, the bodies were gone. Whoever had done it had covered their tracks well. They never found the poachers, never even got a decent lead. As far as I know, the case went cold. But I never forgot what I saw. The worst part was that I didn't know who the men were. They weren't from our town. I would have recognized them. That's what made it worse. The idea that there were people out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, who did things like that without anyone ever knowing. I never went back to that part of the woods. The trails I used to walk felt different now, darker, like they held a secret I wasn't meant to know. And every time I passed by that area, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me. Years have passed since then. I'm an adult now with my own family. I've hiked all over the country, but I still haven't been able to shake the memory of that day. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, I wonder if I'll ever come across those men again, or if they ever stopped what they were doing. Part of me hopes I'll never find out. Back in the summer of '87, My old man, Jack, and his buddies went on a week-long trek through the deep wilderness of the Montana Rockies. They had been doing these kinds of trips for years, packing their bags with just the essentials, heading off the beaten paths, and completely cutting themselves off from civilization. It was their way of escaping the noise of daily life, of testing themselves against the wild. Jack was in his early 30s then, young but experienced. He knew how to navigate the backcountry, how to read the land, how to spot a storm before it hit. He and his closest friends, Dave, Tony, and Rick, had been planning this particular trip for months. They had mapped out a trail through Gallatin National Forest, a place they had heard about from other outdoorsmen. The plan was to start at a remote trailhead, hike deep into the forest, and then loop back after a week. For the first few days, the trip went as expected. They followed the trails during the day, cutting through dense trees and climbing rocky ridges. At night, they made camp in open meadows or near slow-moving streams. The days were long and exhausting, but that was the point. They wanted to push themselves, to feel the weight of the wild pressing in on them. It wasn't until the fourth night that things took a strange turn. They had set up camp in a narrow valley, surrounded on both sides by steep hills covered in thick pine trees. The spot seemed safe, sheltered from the wind and hidden away from any large predators that might be roaming the area. The stream nearby provided fresh water, and the ground was soft enough for their tents. After a long day of hiking, they ate a quick meal, sat around the fire for a bit, and then turned in for the night. Jack wasn't sure what woke him up. Maybe it was the sound of the wind moving through the trees, or the way the tent fabric shifted slightly. He lay there for a moment, staring at the darkness, his breath slow and steady. Then he realized he needed to take a leak. Carefully, he unzipped the tent, trying not to wake Dave, who was sleeping beside him. The night was cool and the forest was quiet, so quiet it almost felt unnatural. He stepped outside, barefoot, feeling the cold dirt beneath him. That's when he saw them. Pair of feet. Bare, pale feet standing just outside the firelight's reach. Jack's heart slammed in his chest. The feet weren't moving, weren't making a sound. They were just there, toes pointed slightly inward, skin blotchy with age. One ankle was swollen, almost misshapen, with a lump near the bone. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to move, to say something, but his body wouldn't respond. Then suddenly the spell broke. He sucked in a breath, stumbled backward, and yanked the tent flap closed. The sound of the zipper cutting through the silence was sharp, almost deafening. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, heart hammering. He shook Dave awake. "Dave, wake up. There's someone out there." Dave groggily sat up, rubbing his face. What? What are you talking about?" Jack's voice was shaking. "I saw feet, bare feet, just standing there. That woke everyone up." Rick and Tony unzipped their own tents, grabbing their flashlights. They stepped outside, shining the beams around the campsite. The light cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees, the rocks, the uneven ground. But there was nothing there. Jack kept repeating what he saw, describing the feet in detail. The color of the skin, the strange way they stood, the lump on the right ankle. At that moment, Tony went pale. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the ground. Then, without warning, he said, "We need to move." Jack blinked. "What?" "Pack up. Now." Dave and Rick exchanged looks. "Tony, come on. It was probably just a trick of the light or... We don't have time." Tony cut him off, his voice firm. "We're moving." Jack had known Tony for years. He wasn't the type to panic. If Tony was serious about something, you listened. So, without arguing, they packed up their gear, shoving everything into their packs as quickly as they could. Within minutes, they were moving up the hillside, climbing away from the ravine where they had set up camp. No one spoke as they hiked in the dark, the weight of something unseen pressing on their shoulders. They finally stopped at the top of the ridge, setting up a rough camp under a rocky overhang. No one slept much that night. When morning came, they made their way back down the hillside, curiosity getting the better of them. But as soon as they reached the valley floor, their stomachs turned. The campsite was gone, or rather, it was buried. A flash flood had torn through the ravine overnight, uprooting trees and turning the soft ground into a mess of mud and debris. If they had stayed down there, they wouldn't have stood a chance. For a long time, they just stood there, looking at the destruction. Then Jack turned to Tony. "How did you know?" Tony hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "A month ago, my grandfather died." Jack frowned. "What does that have to do with?" Tony cut him off. "He had a bad ankle. Looked just like what you described." He swallowed hard, shaking his head. "Before he passed, he told me he'd always watch over me." They didn't talk about it again. They just gathered their gear and kept moving. Years later, Jack would still tell the story, but he never tried to explain it. Maybe it was just luck. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, it saved their lives that night. I had just graduated from college, and like many others who find themselves freshly free from the constraints of academia, I was eager to step into something new. But for me, that something new didn't mean going out and celebrating with friends. Instead, it meant something that felt more like an escape. I didn't have many friends in the area, so with the summer heat pressing down on the Midwest, I decided to head out into the mountains for a solo hiking trip, something to clear my head and reconnect with nature. The area I chose was one that I had hiked before, though not extensively. It was a wild stretch of land located just north of the Cascades, far from the well-beaten paths that most people knew about. There was a little-known, unmarked herding trail that followed along an isolated creek, snaking its way through spruce trees and tall grass. This was the kind of place you had to be familiar with to find, the kind of place where you'd get lost if you weren't paying attention. I knew I was pushing it, going alone into a place so far off the radar that no one would even know where I was. But it felt right. The hike had been on my mind for weeks, and the thought of solitude in such a pristine wilderness was too tempting to pass up. I threw my hiking boots on, made sure to wear long pants, not wanting to deal with ticks, and set off early in the morning before the heat really kicked in. By midday, though, the sun was already high in the sky, and I had been hiking for hours without much of a break. The stream beside me babbled happily, the sound of the water creating a soothing rhythm in the otherwise quiet landscape. Tall spruce trees lined the banks, their dark green needles almost black under the sun, creating a striking contrast with the yellow-green of the grass that bent with the wind. The air smelled fresh, clean, like wet earth and pine resin. It was an unspoiled place, untouched by the usual hustle and bustle of human activity. But as much as I loved the peace, the heat was beginning to take its toll. Even with long pants, the sweat began to trickle down my back. I kept pushing forward, but the weight of the day was settling on me. After a few more miles, I came to a bend in the creek, a particularly picturesque spot where the water curved around a small outcropping of rocks, flowing in a peaceful, winding way. The bend seemed like the perfect place to rest. There was a large rock on the far side of the creek that looked like a perfect spot to sit. But more than that, the water in the creek was shimmering, so inviting, so cold-looking, and in that moment, nothing felt better than the thought of cooling off in that icy water. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was a foolish idea to strip down and wade in, but the heat made that hesitation fleeting. I looked around. No one would be out here. This was as remote as it gets. The thought of being undisturbed in such a vast, wild place soothed me. So I shed my clothes without a second thought, wading in until the water reached my chest. It was colder than I expected, the icy shock of the water causing me to gasp as I slowly moved deeper. But it felt so good. My skin flushed with relief as the cold water surrounded me, every inch of me being numbed by its cool touch. I leaned back, letting the water hold me, my body floating lazily with the current. For a while, I simply lay there, closing my eyes and soaking in the silence, broken only by the gentle flow of the creek and the occasional rustle of the spruce trees in the breeze. It was so peaceful, the kind of peaceful I hadn't felt in months. There was something liberating about being alone in the wilderness like this. No one to answer to, no one to distract me from the world around me. I could just be. But as much as I enjoyed the moment, I eventually realized that I had been in the water for longer than I thought. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, and I knew that I needed to get moving soon if I wanted to make it back to the car before it got dark. I took a deep breath, preparing to wade back to shore. But then, just as I moved, something caught my eye. A slight movement from behind the bend in the creek, just up ahead. I froze. A bull moose, a massive one, had stepped into the water, its dark brown coat slick with moisture. It was standing just a few feet ahead, drinking from the creek, unaware of my presence. I could see the muscles in its legs ripple as it shifted its weight, its large hooves sinking into the muddy creek bed. The antlers on its head were massive, a crown of antlers spreading out like branches of a tree. My heart pounded in my chest. Panic instantly flooded through me. I was stuck in the water, and the moose was only about 50 feet away. It was so close that I could hear its breathing, steady and deep, as it drank from the creek. I hadn't made a sound, had barely even dared to breathe since I first spotted it. My first instinct was to back away slowly, but I was trapped in the water, and my body felt frozen, as though the moose's massive presence had anchored me in place. The silence around us was thick, oppressive. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I forced myself to take a shallow breath, trying to keep calm. Slowly, carefully, I turned around, praying that I wouldn't make a sound. The water was deeper than I thought, and as I began to move, the current fought against me, pushing me back toward the moose. Every step felt like it could alert it, but somehow, I made it a little ways back toward the bank. "I don't want to die," I whispered under my breath, the words almost an automatic response to my fear. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the panic building, but I had to keep moving. I had to get out of the water before that moose decided I was a threat. My bare feet slid against the rocks, but I kept moving. The moose didn't seem to notice me, and I took another shaky step back, then another. I felt exposed, naked, and vulnerable, but there was no time to think about that. I was too close to a large, unpredictable wild animal. What if it decided to charge? By the time my feet touched the shore, I was in full panic mode. I grabbed my clothes, my shirt, my pants, my boots, and in a blind rush, I sprinted through the woods, adrenaline surging. I didn't care that I was still naked, that my feet were hurting from running over rough terrain. I just wanted to be far away from that moose. I ran through the trees, branches whipping at my skin, and the only thing that mattered was the distance between me and the creature I had almost shared the water with. My heart thudded against my chest as I pushed through the brush, not even caring if I was making noise anymore. It was a strange feeling, the fear mixed with an odd sense of exhilaration. There was something primal about it, the flight response kicking in full force. Eventually, I couldn't run anymore. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and my legs burned with exhaustion. I stopped for a moment, hands on my knees, panting in the middle of the woods. My mind was racing. What had just happened? I could still hear the rush of my heartbeat in my ears, the echo of that panic that had overtaken me. I pulled on my underwear and shoes, trying to steady my breathing. The calmness of the forest seemed foreign now, almost eerie, as though I had crossed some invisible boundary. I needed to get back to my car, and fast. The rest of the hike out felt like a blur. My mind was still racing, caught up in the adrenaline of what I had just narrowly avoided. When I finally reached the parking lot, I collapsed in my car, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were still shaking, and my chest was tight, but the worst was over. I sat there for what felt like forever, trying to calm myself, trying to slow my breath. When I finally gathered myself enough to drive, I left the wilderness behind, the towering trees and the cool waters fading into the distance. I couldn't stop thinking about the moose, about how close I had come to something I had no business being near. I was shaken, not just from the fear, but from the raw reminder of how vulnerable we can be in nature. And as I drove, I realized that no matter how well I thought I knew the land, how many hikes I'd been on, there would always be a new lesson out there, a reminder that sometimes nature doesn't give us a second chance. I wasn't sure if I'd ever go back to that spot, but I knew one thing for sure: I'd never forget it. The fear, the rush, and the sheer awe of being in the presence of something so wild, so untamed, would stay with me forever. It was about 15 years ago when I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the remote islands off the coast of Alaska. I had been hiking for days through thick forest, the kind where the trees seem to stretch endlessly into the sky and the undergrowth is dense enough to make every step an effort. Eventually, I reached a small cove with a narrow strip of rocky beach, and I knew this was where I'd set up camp for the night. The air was crisp, carrying that familiar briny scent of the ocean mixed with the earthy aroma of damp moss and cedar. I set up my small tent just beyond the high tide line, where the sand met the trees. The view was perfect, open ocean stretching toward the horizon, framed by jagged black rocks that jutted out of the water like ancient sentinels. A light mist clung to the surface of the water, and the sound of the waves rolling in was steady, rhythmic, and calming. After setting up camp, I got to work catching my dinner. It wasn't long before I hooked a decent-sized rockfish, and soon I had it roasting over a small fire. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the satisfaction of a meal well earned. There was something profoundly peaceful about being alone out here, cut off from the rest of the world. No phones, no traffic, no artificial noise. Just me, the fire, and the ocean. As the sky darkened and the stars began to emerge, I doused my fire, ensuring that not even a stray ember remained. The tide had started creeping in, and soon, the waves would reclaim the patch of beach where I had cooked my dinner. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap shut, and lay back against my sleeping bag. The sound of the waves mixed with the distant calls of seabirds, and before I knew it, sleep took me. Sometime deep in the night, I woke suddenly. Something was breathing, not the steady rhythm of the waves, not the wind shifting through the trees. Something close, something big. The sound was deep and slow, almost like a giant lung inhaling and exhaling just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was a bear, but then logic kicked in. There weren't supposed to be bears on these islands, not a single documented case. The isolation of these islands made it nearly impossible for them to swim across. My mind raced, searching for possibilities. Then another thought crept in, one I tried to push away. Bigfoot. Ridiculous. But in the pitch-black silence of the wilderness, fear makes strange things seem plausible. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible, straining my ears. The heavy breathing was still there, slow and deliberate. Then a splash. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking slightly, and unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The darkness outside was thick, my fire long extinguished, the moonlight offering only vague silhouettes of the landscape. I clicked the flashlight on and swept it across the beach. Nothing. I waited, heart still pounding. Then it came again. A deep, guttural breath, followed by another splash. I stepped out of my tent, moving cautiously, my boots crunching softly on the damp sand. I raised my flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. A massive, rolling form, black and white, glistening under the beam of my flashlight. It took my brain a second to process what I was looking at. A fully grown orca, lying in the shallows, rolling in the kelp. Relief washed over me, immediately followed by awe. This thing was enormous, easily 20 feet long, maybe more. It exhaled again, a deep whooshing sound that sent a fine mist into the cold night air. As I stood there, dumbfounded, I realized there was more movement just beyond the shallows. More orcas, their dorsal fins breaking the surface, barely moving, almost like they were resting. I had heard about this before, how orcas sometimes come into shallow waters to rub their bodies against the rocks and kelp, an ancient behavior passed down through generations. But to witness it firsthand, at this hour, in this remote corner of the world, was something else entirely. For what felt like an eternity, I just stood there, watching. The massive orca rolled onto its side, exposing the stark contrast of black and white, the sleekness of its body catching the light in a way that made it seem almost unreal. The others remained just offshore, barely moving, their presence more sensed than seen. I sat down right there on the damp sand, watching in silent reverence. It wasn't just one of them, it was an entire pod, resting, playing, existing in a way that felt ancient and primal. The ocean was theirs. I was just a guest on their shore. I must have stayed like that for hours, unable to bring myself to go back into my tent. Sleep was out of the question now. Eventually, as the tide began to recede, the massive orca gave one final exhale, rolled again, and, with a few powerful strokes of its tail, pushed itself back into deeper water. The others followed, their dark shapes vanishing into the blackness of the ocean. The night was silent once more. I sat there until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, my mind still struggling to process what I had just seen. The experience had started as one of the most terrifying moments of my life, but in the end, it turned into something profoundly beautiful, something I would never forget. I packed up my camp that morning with a strange sense of reverence. As I hiked away from that beach, I found myself looking back, half expecting to see them again. But the water was calm, the only evidence of the night before being the damp patches of kelp and the faint impressions left in the sand where the massive orca had rested. Years later, I still think about that night, the fear, the awe, the absolute rawness of it all. And I remind myself that sometimes the scariest things in the wild aren't monsters or myths. Sometimes they're just something far bigger than yourself, something that reminds you how small you really are. It was early November, the kind of time when darkness comes too soon. The sky had turned from deep blue to black faster than I expected, and the cold air wrapped around me, creeping through my jacket and biting at my skin. I was walking back to my parents' country house after spending the evening with some friends in the nearby town. It wasn't too far, maybe 2 or 3 kilometers from where I was now, but out here in the countryside, a short distance could feel like an eternity when you were alone in the dark. I was 16, young but not completely naive. I had walked this path 100 times before, in daylight and darkness, in rain and clear skies. I knew every turn, every dip in the road, every tree that lined the way. But something about that night felt different. There was a kind of stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet. No wind rustling the branches, no distant hum of cars from the main road. Just my footsteps crunching over the gravel and dirt, the rhythmic sound of my breathing, and the occasional rustle of dry leaves as I passed. Kilometer away from home, I saw it. Across the road, a light, a lantern, swaying slightly, held by someone I couldn't see clearly. The darkness swallowed them, only revealing the glow of the lantern bobbing with their movements. I squinted, trying to make out a face or any details, but there was nothing. Just a silhouette and that warm, flickering glow. I kept walking, my pace steady, though my heartbeat had begun to pick up. Maybe it was a neighbor, someone out for a walk, or checking something on their property. People around here did that sometimes. But something about it made my skin crawl. Then suddenly the light shifted. It turned, aiming straight at me, blinding me with its glare. I stopped dead in my tracks, squinting against the brightness. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood there, frozen, staring into that beam of light. I couldn't see anything beyond it, couldn't make out the person holding it. Seconds passed, long and unbearable. The light didn't move, didn't waver, just pointed directly at me. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The lantern turned off, vanishing into the darkness. My eyes strained, adjusting to the sudden blackness, but there was nothing. No movement, no footsteps, no sound. Just the empty road and the trees pressing in around me. Something inside me snapped. I turned and ran. I have never run faster in my life. My feet pounded against the road, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, pushing forward as hard as I could. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but the only thought in my mind was getting home. I wasn't thinking about who that person was or what they wanted. I just knew I had to get away. The road stretched ahead of me, curving slightly before the final straightaway to my parents' house. My legs threatened to give out, but I pushed on. My body was running on pure adrenaline. My mind filled with a single primal instinct: escape. Finally, I saw it, the porch light of our house glowing faintly in the distance. A small, warm beacon in the endless darkness. I pushed myself harder, closing the last stretch of road as fast as my legs could carry me. When I reached the front door, I nearly collapsed against it, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so hard it took me 3 tries to fit the key into the lock. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it immediately. My chest heaved, my entire body shaking. I stood there, back against the door, listening, waiting, nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. No footsteps on the porch, no tapping on the windows, no creaking of the floorboards outside. I stayed there for what felt like forever, trying to slow my breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who had that been? Why had they pointed the light at me? And where had they gone when the light turned off? I knew these roads. There was nowhere to disappear to that quickly. No deep ditches, no thick bushes to hide in. Just open road and sparse trees. Eventually, I moved away from the door, my body still trembling. I checked all the locks, peered out the windows, but I saw nothing but darkness beyond the glow of the porch light. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, to tell myself it was nothing. Just some stranger out at night. No harm done. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made my heart race. Every shadow in my room felt too dark, too deep. My mind wouldn't stop replaying those long seconds when the lantern pointed at me, wouldn't stop questioning what I had seen or what I hadn't seen. The next morning, in the safety of daylight, I went outside. The road looked normal like it always had. No signs of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing. It was as if it had never happened. I never saw anything like that again. Never saw another lantern. Never heard any stories of strange figures on that road. It became just another memory, one that I tried to push to the back of my mind. But even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. And every time I walk alone at night, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't run? I was solo camping along the Blackwater River, deep in the forests of West Virginia. It was late September, just as the leaves were starting to turn, and I had decided to take a weekend for myself. Just me, my gear, and the sound of the river rushing in the background. I was 26 at the time, still new to solo camping but eager to challenge myself. I had camped with friends plenty of times before, but this was my first true solo trip, and I was both excited and anxious. The first day had gone smoothly. I had hiked about 10 miles in, found a decent clearing near the river, and set up my hammock between 2 sturdy trees. I had my small gas stove for cooking, a bare canister for food storage, and my headlamp ready for the night. Everything seemed perfect. By nightfall, I was settled in, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, and the steady flow of the river nearby made for the kind of peacefulness you only get in the wild. I wasn't completely relaxed, though. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Not in a paranoid way, just the natural sense that comes when you're alone in the wilderness, where your instincts sharpen whether you want them to or not. I dozed off sometime around 10, wrapped in my sleeping bag, swaying gently in my hammock. Then, a jolt snapped me awake. Something was shaking my hammock. Violently, my heart slammed into my throat. I could feel the movement through my back, like something was tugging at my setup. Adrenaline shot through me, and my first thought was that it was a bear. I reached for my flashlight and slowly poked my head out. That's when I saw it. A goddamn raccoon. It was gripping one of my boots in its little hands, tugging at it with all the determination of a beast possessed. The moment my flashlight beam hit it, the raccoon froze. Its beady little eyes reflected the light back at me, making it look even more sinister than it already did. It hesitated for only a moment before yanking again, nearly pulling the boot free. I jerked my leg, kicking at the air, and the raccoon let out a chittering sound before scampering off into the underbrush. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I had to take a few deep breaths to calm myself down. I told myself it was just a stupid raccoon, nothing to be scared of. I shook my head, tucked my boots under my hammock so the little bastard couldn't get to them again, and tried to go back to sleep. But that wasn't the end of it. Those little gremlins tormented me all night long. Every hour, like clockwork, they returned. I could hear them rustling through the leaves, sniffing around my gear, scratching at the sides of my bear canister. They were relentless. At one point, I felt something tugging at my sleeping bag, and I nearly lost my mind. I turned on my flashlight more times than I could count, each time catching a glimpse of those little thieves darting away, only to return minutes later. They chattered and chirped, almost as if they were laughing at me. The worst part was that I couldn't do much to stop them. I wasn't about to go stomping around the woods in the dead of night chasing after raccoons, so I had to endure it. Every time I started drifting off, I'd hear them creeping closer, rummaging through whatever they could find. My food was safe, locked away, but that didn't stop them from trying. Morning couldn't come fast enough. By the time the first hints of light started filtering through the trees, I felt like I had aged 10 years. I was exhausted, my nerves were shot, and I was more than ready to pack up and get the hell out of there. When I climbed out of my hammock, the damage was obvious. My campsite looked like a crime scene. My gear was scattered. My backpack had been dragged a few feet away, the pockets unzipped, the contents strewn about. My cooking pot was overturned, and my boots were damp with little muddy paw prints. They had even managed to chew through one of my straps, likely in some desperate attempt to steal whatever they could. I was furious, but more than anything, I was just done. I packed up my things, checked to make sure I hadn't lost anything important, and started hiking back. The entire way, I felt like I was still being watched. Maybe it was just my paranoia after the night I had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those little bastards were still lurking in the trees, watching me leave, probably waiting for the next poor sucker to come along. By the time I made it back to my car, I was relieved beyond words. I threw my gear into the trunk, sat in the driver's seat, and just took a moment to breathe. The moral of the story? Don't feed the damn animals. Ever. Not even once. If you think raccoons are cute, wait until you're alone in the woods at midnight, and they're treating your campsite like their personal buffet. Lesson learned. It was late October, and I'd been out on my land for a few days. The sun had been hiding behind thick clouds, casting an eerie gray light over the hills. I had come up here to figure out next year's feed plots. The soil needed preparation before the first frost, and I'd been walking the paths, marking areas where the deer seemed to be frequenting. I was dressed in my usual camo gear, trying to blend into the landscape. My boots crunched on the dried leaves as I made my way down toward the river. This part of the property was near the back edge, where the terrain dipped down into a small valley. The river was usually a peaceful place, a spot where I'd sit sometimes, just to enjoy the solitude. But today felt different. The air had that still, heavy quality to it, like something was waiting or maybe watching. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the weather messing with my mind. As I walked, I noticed something odd. About 100 yards ahead, just off the trail, was a tent. At first, I thought it might have been someone camping illegally on the property, but it didn't make sense. The tent looked old, the kind that you wouldn't see someone using unless they were deliberately trying to hide. There were no vehicles nearby, no campfires, no sign of anyone being around. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call it in or just leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I walked closer, moving quietly through the underbrush. That's when I saw her. At first, she was a shape, barely visible through the trees, walking toward me. She wasn't moving fast, just calmly strolling down the path, her figure framed by the soft mist rolling off the river. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were a few properties nearby, and some of the old-timers still wandered the woods now and then. But as she came closer, I began to feel something strange. I stood still, half hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. She was dressed in a long, worn-out coat, and her hair was tangled wild, almost like she hadn't seen a comb in years. There was something unsettling about the way she moved. It wasn't hurried or erratic. It was slow and deliberate, like she knew exactly where she was going, even though I couldn't figure out where that might be. She walked closer still, her feet barely making a sound on the soft ground. I couldn't see her face yet, just the silhouette. My heart began to pick up speed, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe she was just some eccentric hiker, or someone who had wandered too far off a nearby trail. But then, as she came into full view, I realized something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was a faint stench in the air, one that didn't belong in the woods. It was sour, almost nauseating, like something was decaying. And then I saw what she was doing. She walked straight up to a patch of ground just a few feet away from me and squatted down. Without any hesitation, she did what I can only describe as a primitive act, right there in the middle of the woods. I froze, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Was she out of her mind? Who would just do that? For a second, I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning. I had no idea who she was or why she was here, but one thing was for sure, this wasn't normal. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like the right thing to do. I held it through the gap in the leaves, my hand trembling slightly. Maybe I thought I could help somehow. Maybe give her some sign that I was there, but didn't want to make myself known. It was the strangest instinct, but it felt like the only way to communicate in that moment. When I did that, she suddenly looked up at me, her wild eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, her gaze unnerving, almost knowing. Then something shifted. She scrambled to her feet in an almost frantic way, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She tripped over a rock, stumbling backward, but quickly regained her balance and started running, her feet pounding against the earth as she fled deeper into the woods. I stood there, completely frozen for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think, didn't know what had just happened. The whole encounter had been surreal, like something out of a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the woman wasn't just some random person who had wandered in. There was something deliberate about her presence, something intentional. I waited for what seemed like forever, until I finally gathered the strength to move again. I made my way over to the spot where she'd been, half expecting to see something strange, something out of place. But there was nothing, just the same old patch of ground, now quiet and still. No sign of her. That's when I remembered something strange I'd overheard at the local diner a few weeks back. One of the older guys, Grady, I think his name was, had mentioned something about a former commune that used to occupy the back part of the land, back in the 70s and 80s. The so-called hippie colony, he'd called it. They'd been gone for decades, but some people still thought they had left something behind. He had said something about their children coming back, though I hadn't really given it much thought at the time. Now, it seemed more than just a story. I walked back up the path, my mind racing. The woman I'd seen, there was something about her. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was connected to something from the past, something I hadn't fully understood until now. The idea that the children of that old commune might be coming back didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Maybe they'd never really left. Maybe they had been living on the outskirts of the land, hidden away, like ghosts of another time. But what did they want? And why had she run when she saw me? I didn't know the answers, but I was beginning to realize that this part of my property was more than just land. It was a piece of history. And whatever had happened here before, whatever it was, wasn't finished. Not yet. I had been hiking alone for years. It was something I enjoyed, something that made me feel free. The isolation, the raw, untamed land stretching out in every direction. It was peace. I grew up in Montana, hunting and fishing with my father from a young age. I knew the woods well, understood the sounds, the tracks, the presence of animals before I ever laid eyes on them. I had been face to face with bears, had heard the eerie calls of mountain lions, and had spent countless nights alone in the wild without fear. Until that night. It was late September, 1998. The air was cold but dry, the kind of weather that makes for good hiking. I had taken a few days off work, driven up to the Absorca-Beartooth Wilderness, and planned to spend 3 nights out in the backcountry. This wasn't a popular trail, and that was intentional. I preferred the solitude, the absence of other hikers, the silence that only deep wilderness can offer. The first day went smoothly. I made it about 15 miles in, set up camp near a small creek, and got a fire going before the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in my sleeping bag inside my small one-man tent. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. Not to a sound, exactly, more to a presence. My body, honed by years of hunting and camping, told me something was wrong before my mind caught up. My heart pounded in my ears as I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, deep, steady breaths. Not mine, not some distant animal rustling in the woods. This was close, right outside my tent, and it was big. I held my breath, straining to hear beyond the blood pounding in my ears. It wasn't the short, frantic breathing of a deer or the low, grunting breaths of a bear. This was something else. Deep, intentional, measured. The way something breathes when it knows exactly where it is, exactly what it's doing. I had my shotgun next to me, loaded with buckshot. My hand moved slowly, inching toward it, fingers wrapping around the stock. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Maybe. But bears make noise. They grunt, they sniff, they move. This thing wasn't moving, just breathing. I swallowed hard and finally managed to sit up slowly, careful not to make a sound. I pointed the shotgun in the direction of the breathing, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. It went on for what felt like an eternity. I kept waiting for it to move, to make some other sound, but it didn't. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Not like something walking away, not like an animal losing interest and lumbering off. Just stopped, as if it had never been there at all. I sat there, frozen, for another hour at least. My hands ached from gripping the shotgun too tightly. My eyes burned from staying locked open, but I couldn't move. I couldn't risk making a sound. Eventually, the first signs of dawn crept into the sky. The moment there was enough light to see, I forced myself out of the tent, shotgun at the ready. I expected something, tracks, disturbed ground, some sign of an animal, but there was nothing. The dirt outside my tent was smooth, untouched. No footprints, no broken twigs, no disturbed leaves. I knew what bear tracks looked like. I knew what elk tracks looked like. I knew the patterns of every major animal in these woods, but there was nothing. I packed up camp in record time. I wasn't about to spend another night out there. The hike back was grueling, my mind replaying the sound of that breathing over and over again. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me, but I never did. I made it back to my truck by midday. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors the moment I got inside, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. My shotgun was still loaded on the passenger seat. I never left it that way in my truck, but I wasn't taking any chances. To this day, I don't know what it was. I've heard every theory you can imagine. Someone messing with me? Unlikely. I was miles from the nearest person. A mountain lion? They're silent hunters. A bear? Bears don't breathe like that, and they sure as hell leave tracks. Some people have even suggested something paranormal, but I don't buy into that. All I know is that night was the first and only time I ever truly felt like prey, and I've never gone back to that place again. It was late October, and the air had a sharp edge to it, the kind that made your lungs burn just a little with every inhale. I was hiking alone through the North Cascades, a remote trail I had planned for weeks. Most people had already packed up their gear for the season, knowing the cold nights and unpredictable weather made the mountains less forgiving this time of year. But I liked that. The solitude, the quiet, just me, the trees, and the rhythm of my own footsteps crunching over fallen leaves. My dog, a big black lab named Ranger, trotted beside me, ears alert and tail swaying. He was my only company, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I had been hiking for most of the morning, making my way up a steep set of switchbacks that wound their way up the side of a mountain. The incline burned my legs, and I could feel the sweat gathering under my pack straps despite the chill in the air. About halfway up, I decided to take a break. I stepped off the trail onto a small, flat patch of ground covered in damp pine needles and let my pack drop with a heavy thud. I stretched out on my back, breathing hard, staring up at the thin gray sky through the lattice of tree branches. Ranger sat beside me, his big body radiating warmth in the cold air. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant sound of a bird calling somewhere down the valley. It was peaceful, just how I liked it. Then, the sound of footsteps crunching down the trail pulled me from my rest. 2 men were coming down the switchbacks, moving quickly. I sat up, pulling Ranger a little closer as they approached. I always paid attention to who I met on the trail. Out here, miles from the nearest road, you had to. The men looked like they were in their late 30s, maybe early 40s. Both wore dark jackets and carried lightweight packs. They moved with an ease that suggested experience, but there was something about the way they walked that made me uneasy, like they weren't just hiking, but looking for something, or someone. I gave them a polite nod and a small wave as they came closer. One of them, the taller of the two with a thick beard and a beanie pulled low over his forehead, nodded back. The other, shorter with a lean build and a clean-shaven face, smiled at me, then suddenly stopped walking. "Oh," he said, like he had just noticed something. "You're alone." He turned to his friend, and they exchanged a glance. Not a casual one, not the kind you'd expect between 2 hikers passing by. It was quick, but there was something in it that made my skin go tight. A silent exchange of words I wasn't supposed to understand. Ranger must have sensed it too, because he stood up, muscles tensed, and stared at them. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just fixed them with a look that was all business. The shorter guy's smile faltered. "Nice dog," he said, his voice a little different now, stiffer. "Yeah," I said. My voice was steady, but inside, my heart was picking up speed. The taller one cleared his throat. "Well, have a good one." They moved past me, their pace suddenly a little quicker, their posture a little stiffer. I watched them go, my eyes following them until they disappeared around the next switchback. Even after they were out of sight, I waited, listening. Nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees, rustling the dry leaves. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. Something about that exchange wasn't right. Maybe I was being paranoid, maybe they were just making conversation, but the way they reacted when they saw I was alone, it didn't sit right with me. And the way they hurried off after noticing Ranger, that wasn't normal. I decided to keep moving. I shouldered my pack, gave Ranger a reassuring pat, and kept climbing. I wanted more distance between me and them, just in case. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky was turning a dull orange. I had planned to camp near a small lake another mile ahead, but now I wasn't sure. Instead of stopping in an open area, I decided to find a less obvious spot, off-trail, a place where I wouldn't be easily seen. I hiked another half-mile and then turned off, pushing through the underbrush until I found a small clearing nestled between thick trees. I set up camp quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. I didn't light a fire. I ate a protein bar and some jerky in silence, listening. Nothing but the usual forest sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I wanted to be. That night, Ranger was restless. He normally curled up next to my sleeping bag and barely moved until morning. But tonight he kept lifting his head, ears pricked toward the darkness beyond the tent. I stayed awake longer than I should have, listening for anything out of place. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch had my heart pounding. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke sometime in the early hours, when the world was still pitch black. Ranger was up, standing at the entrance of the tent, ears forward, body tense. He wasn't growling, but his tail was straight, his head low. I reached for my headlamp, clicked it on, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing, just trees stretching out into the darkness. The wind had picked up, making the branches sway, but no movement, no sound beyond the usual. I stayed like that for a long time, just watching, waiting. My mind kept going back to those two guys, the way they looked at each other, the way they left so quickly when they saw Ranger. I had no proof they had done anything, no real reason to believe they had followed me. But instinct is a funny thing. The rest of the night passed in a haze of half-sleep and restless listening. By the time the first gray light crept through the trees, I was already breaking camp. I packed up fast, keeping Ranger close, and took a different route down the mountain, one that would keep me off the main trail for as long as possible. I never saw those men again. Maybe they were just passing through, maybe I had overreacted. But I don't think so. Somewhere deep in my gut, I knew I wasn't supposed to be out there alone, and they knew it too.